Okay, well, it's nice to meet you.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for coming on. Can you just introduce yourself for my listeners?
Sure. My name is Stephen Donziger. I'm a human rights attorney. I live in New York, and I do a lot of environmental litigation against big polluters, big oil companies.
So I want to talk a little bit about your background because I think there's an interesting context of kind of how you got started in this line of work. I read that your mom was an activist and used to bring you to different things. Can you explain that a bit?
Yeah, so I grew up in Northeast Florida in Jacksonville, which was a pretty conservative area of the country, a lot of military bases. And my mom was always someone who was very engaged in civic life and growing up. So yeah, I went to protests as a little kid, and I remember feeling like, wow, this is important. It's meaningful, and it made me feel good to sort of be able to lend my little voice to others who were struggling for justice.
And so would you say that's kind of the origin story of that desire to get into this line of work?
It is. I think, sometimes it's hard to pinpoint exactly how these things happen, but obviously we're all, to a huge degree products of our upbringings or our parents. And in my case, I think my mom had a huge impact on me, in terms of kind of exposing me to things. It always fascinated me how many problems there were in our country compared to the mythology of what we're taught in school. It just blew my mind, like even noticing things in my hometown or reading about them, So I was always like, I think we could do better. So I think I'm going to work or devote myself in my life to trying to, make conditions better for, others. Because I grew up relatively privileged. I mean, we were upper middle class, and my father was a businessman, and, I had the luxury of not having to think, about a day-to-day existence. We had security, so I think that allowed me to some degree to liberate my thinking into sort of broader issues. And, when I got out of college, I immediately started to work as a professional journalist for United Press International.
Why pivot into law school?
It was very simple. I got really frustrated having to adhere to what at the time was this sort of sense of objectivity, quote unquote, that journalists needed to adhere to write for mainstream newspapers. And I was witnessing all sorts of atrocities and injustices and this war, and I just
felt like press wasn't helping enough.
Right. Well, I felt like I couldn't be myself. I think my best self is being an advocate, not being a chronicler of activity done by others.
Yeah.
So I moved from journalism, as much as I loved it at the time, into law, and I went to law school. And I was fortunate to get into Harvard Law School, and I knew, from day one, and I never wavered, that I was going to use my skills and my education from that school and my contacts to go out and lend my talents to those who are hurting.
Humanitarian efforts.
Yeah, and I always wanted to do that, always have done that. And we had a class of 550 people, and I've been to all our reunions. By the way, Barack Obama was in my law school class.
Really?
Yeah.
Did he come to the last reunion?
No, he didn't come. But a lot of people came, I think, thinking he was going to come, but he never came. And Neil Gorsuch was in my class, Supreme Court Justice. So, it was a class of a lot of really smart, interesting people. And but very few, in the end of the day, really stayed the course after all these years and really, got into the law to spend a lifetime fighting for social justice. I mean, a lot of people who go to law school don't do law, but they are able to run companies and run businesses and run institutions. You can do a lot with it. And I mean, Barack Obama, became a professor and ended up being president.
Okay, so for my listeners who aren't familiar with you and your case, can you kind of give me a brief summary of everything with Chevron? Sure. I mean, it's important jumping off point.
Emphasis on brief. I've been working on this one case for 28 years. I've worked on other cases during that time, but the main case is a case where I represent indigenous peoples and farmer communities in the Amazon rainforest of Ecuador, who live in an area where Chevron operated for 25 years, and they literally dump billions of gallons of cancer-causing oil waste into the environment, into rivers and streams that indigenous groups have been relying on for their drinking water, for their bathing, for their fishing. It was a pure greed play, and it was done deliberately by the company to keep production costs as low as possible. The upshot is thousands of people, based on evidence we've seen, have died of cancer and other oil-related diseases since this happened. It's ongoing, meaning the crisis is still there. Chevron left Ecuador in 1992 and hasn't been back, hasn't paid for a real cleanup, although they claim they did a perfunctory cleanup, but it was really a sham. And I and several other lawyers representing thousands of people who were affected sued Chevron in 1993, and they tried to delay and sabotage the case. But over an 18-year period, we ended up winning a historic pollution judgment, never happened before in history, of roughly $10 billion.
In Ecuador,
in Ecuador's courts, where I'll add, Chevron insisted that the trial be held, and where Chevron accepted jurisdiction. Mm-hmm. The case was initially filed here in New York because this is where the headquarters of Chevron's predecessor company, Texaco, were located. Texaco actually did this, and Chevron then bought Texaco. So Chevron now owns this problem, and they're defending it. So we initially filed suit in New York. They had it sent to Ecuador. They said, they insisted it go there. I think their thinking was that if they could just get it down to Ecuador, we would give up. We wouldn't be able to pursue the case there because it's a different legal system, far away land. No one would see it.
They could potentially bribe.
And I think they thought they could just, play the dirty tricks games that the oil industry is used to playing and get rid of the case. But it didn't happen, because we had a great team, and, we had many talented lawyers and advocates, and we ended up kicking their butt. I mean, they thought they could get rid of us, and, we probably spent $1 for every 1,000 they spent, literally. I mean, they had the best lawyers. They've had dozens of law firms working on this, and we have a small team of really dedicated lawyers, me among them. And we ended up winning this historic case. And after that, rather than pay the judgment, they vowed to fight the indigenous peoples. Literally, this was a quote from their lead lawyer: "We will fight them until hell freezes over, and then we will fight it out on the ice." So they were threatening the indigenous peoples. And rather than pay the judgment, they decided to hire a law firm to target me personally here in New York, which has led to a 12-year sort of litigation battle between me, the person, and Chevron, as opposed to the people of Ecuador and Chevron. And they're using it to try to distract attention from their crimes, their environmental crimes in the Amazon, and the fact people are dying down there. But it's been a hell of a ride for me, and I ended up in prison, or I should say in detention, for almost 3 years as a result.
Mm-hmm. And I'm sure we'll get to that. That is a good summary.
Is that too long?
No, that was perfect. Yeah. But there's just so much to explore here. I guess, what were you even prosecuted for?
So what happened was, after we won the case in Ecuador and it was affirmed on appeal by Ecuador's Supreme Court, even in Canada, the Supreme Court affirmed the judgment for enforcement purposes because they wouldn't pay. We had to go to Canada to try to recover the money from their assets in Canada. And as all this was going on and we were winning all sorts of court cases, they went after me here in New York, before a very friendly pro-corporate federal judge named Lewis Kaplan. And they convinced him to issue an order that I turn over my computer and cell phone to Chevron's lawyers in the middle of this civil litigation. And I told Judge Kaplan that I couldn't do that. I had an ethical obligation not to turn over protected attorney-client information. I said I need to appeal this order. And while I was appealing what was clearly, in my view, an unlawful order, he charged me with what's called criminal contempt of court, which is basically the one area of the criminal law that a judge can charge a crime. It's like if you disobey a judge's order, they can put you in jail, basically. And even though I didn't disobey the order, I appealed it. He still, because he was so in Chevron's corner, in my opinion, went after me and charged me with with this misdemeanor crime for basically representing the interests of my clients down in Ecuador. And much to my shock, when I showed up in court to deal with this the next time, he had me locked up in my home with an ankle bracelet. And I stayed there literally for 2 years and 2 months in my home waiting for my trial. It wouldn't let me out.
Which is the longest I read that someone or a lawyer who hasn't done anything violent, like it's a non-violent petty crime.
Exactly. It's the lowest level offense. First of all, there was no crime. Let me be clear.
No, yeah.
But even if you were to assume they were right, like you don't lock up lawyers for
Well, I'm confused. What was their reasoning for, were you a flight risk to them?
Yeah, so they said I was a flight risk, that I was going to flee the country to avoid a misdemeanor offense, which is maximum 6 months in prison. By the way, first I would never do that. I'm a man who stays and fights. I've been doing this case for 28 years. Well, also, it was all just concocted to, I believe, keep me from traveling out of the country to do my work, because we were in Canada, we were in other countries trying to enforce the Ecuador judgment. And this was just a ruse by Chevron and this judge to keep me from traveling and also to punish me, to send a message of intimidation to other lawyers and climate activists who want to hold the fossil fuel industry accountable. They wanted to really weaponize the law against me and cause me to suffer. And I think they tried to really, it was their plan to try to destroy my life. I mean, they really wanted to basically ruin my life. I mean, this came out in emails we got from them in the discovery process. They said in 2009, there was an email from a Chevron official that said our LT strategy, long-term strategy, is to demonize Donziger. Mm-hmm. Like they want to talk about anything but the toxic dumping they did in the Amazon.
Why you specifically out of all the lawyers?
I think mainly because I was the main driving force of the case.
Okay, you were the most outspoken.
I'd worked on it from the beginning. I was in the media. I had credibility. I was respected. And I was also responsible for getting in all the money, meaning the financing of the case. These cases aren't cheap. So they sort of assessed the landscape, and I think they calculated that if they could knock me out, get me to quit, or somehow render me unable to work, they would win the case. They knew they couldn't win it on the merits of the claims. We had already won it.
And also probably scare off, if they can ruin your life, that sends a message.
That's so true. And I think part of it is they tried to, use their attacks on me not only to render me unable to work, but to send a message to others who would do this work that if you do this work, you're going to end up like him. Let me be very clear. It didn't work, their strategy, because here I am talking about it. And I'm good, I'm happy, I have a family, and I have a much larger platform now than I ever did before they started to attack me. I think it actually backfired. Not to mention the fact there's dozens of lawyers around the world who are trying to get in this case so the judgment can be enforced against their assets. So it didn't work. But I think it didn't work for various reasons, the main one of which is that I didn't let it work. Like I'm a very resilient person. And I fought my butt off when I was in home detention to build awareness of what was happening to me. Because people need to understand, okay, not only did the judge charge me with criminal contempt, but he took his criminal contempt charges to the U.S. attorney, that is the federal prosecutor here in New York, who refused to prosecute me because he knew the charges were unfounded. When he refused to prosecute me, the case should have ended at that point. Instead, Judge Kaplan appointed a private Chevron law firm. Think about this. To prosecute me in the name of the U.S. government. And I became the first person in the history of this country, and to this day the only person in the history of this country ever to be targeted with a private corporate prosecution in the name of the U.S. government. And it wasn't just any corporation that prosecuted me, it was the same one, Chevron, that I had just kicked the butt of in a long trial in Ecuador where we won this historic pollution judgment.
Mm-hmm. And there's no jury, right?
And there's no jury. So basically, Chevron, this is called corporate capture. I mean, you see this in of the EPA and regulatory agencies, and you see it in Congress to a great degree. And now we're seeing it in our court system where a lot of the judges are captured by corporations in order to carry out their private agendas at public expense.
How is that not illegal?
It is illegal, in my opinion. I'm still appealing it.
Yeah.
But, the problem is a lot of the judges you appeal to are of the same mentality. And
Like
what
the
we
whole
saw,
system is rigged.
it is, so what they did to me is patently illegal. I mean, it's not just my opinion, by the way. The United Nations Working Group on Arbitrary Detention looked at my case and found that the U.S. courts had violated multiple provisions of international law, and they ordered me released. But the judges just ignored it, and they kept pounding on me, and ultimately I was convicted in a non-jury trial that was, in my opinion, a farce. I mean, the judge wouldn't even let me get up and defend myself.
And they disbarred you?
And they disbarred me as well without a hearing. I couldn't challenge it.
And you're still disbarred?
I'm still disbarred. The judge, issued orders that I owe Chevron millions and millions of dollars to reimburse them for their legal fees. Yeah.
I didn't know that.
I'm off the grid. I don't even have a bank account right now.
I was told that.
Yeah. I mean, this is sort of what you might see in like Russia or China. It's not just Russia. It's not just China. It's happening in the United States. It happened to me, and it's a damn outrage, in my opinion, that someone in this country or any rule of law country could be prosecuted by a private corporation.
Yeah, and the individual against a corporation. It's how do you win that?
Exactly. Well, you just, I have the attitude, like, I'm going to keep fighting. I'm going to keep building support. And all the support I got, I believe, actually saved my life, because the more people became aware of it, the more ridiculous the judge looked.
Like, what is the internal reasoning for the people who sit or who work at Chevron who aren't on the board or who don't have like stock in the company?
Well, let me say this. I think people need to recognize, as many do, that we live in a moment of planetary crisis. And, the earth is burning, partly or largely because of the fossil fuel industry, which continues to drill, emit greenhouse gases, and pollute. And they don't want people like me and others doing this work. I mean, they recognize they are facing their own existential crisis. We're not going to survive unless we phase out that industry in the next few years. And they're just trying to pound on anyone who speaks out. I don't know if you know this, but I was put in prison for 45 days.
Yes,
as part of this process.
And it was supposed to be longer.
It was supposed to be 6 months, but Congress had passed a COVID-era law that allowed you to get out and serve the rest of your sentence at home after 25% of your time.
Okay, so that was also
So the very first day I hit 25%, they dumped me out of the prison gates and told me to go home. Because also I don't think the prison people, I was in Danbury, which is a federal prison up in Connecticut. The administration there didn't really want me there. I was getting a lot of letters. I was getting 100 letters a day in prison. And
so they were
the
like,
prison authorities, they don't like scrutiny, so they're like, I think we're going to go home.
And then so that extended your
and then I had to put the ankle bracelet back on and serve the rest of the 6 months right back where I'd been for 2 years.
And they wouldn't even.
I worked out in my apartment. It was challenging to say the least, but I was able to deal. Like, I basically would divide the day into my work time, and like at the end of the day, no matter what the weather, whether I needed to or not, I would take a shower.
Okay.
And put on a new set of clothes and put on shoes like I was going out. And then I would go to our kitchen and we would cook a good meal. And just act like, I had to demarcate the day. I couldn't just work all the time because I was basically living in a prison cell, even though it was a small apartment. And I needed to sort of figure out techniques to protect my mental health. I mean, because
how do you stay sane?
They wanted. I'm telling you, I think they wanted me to just jump out off the roof of my building. I really believe that. One of my lawyers told me that because they were trying to make my life so miserable. So I was like, that ain't gonna happen. Like, I'm going to actually be happy during this time. I mean, if I can. I mean, obviously it was painful, but there's a lot of joy. I connected with so many people. My physical space was reduced to virtually nothing, but my online space and my connectedness to the world was enhanced by 100-fold. It was crazy. So I actually feel like I grew a lot during the time I was detained.
What did you learn in terms of keeping your sanity?
Well, you need to understand, first of all, that when they first detained me, I was really worried, given how this was going down, that it was unprecedented. A lawyer in this country had never been detained pre-trial on a misdemeanor until me. And it just seemed corrupt. And it made me nervous that they were going to figure out some excuse to put me in jail. Oh, you walked out into your hallway of your apartment building and you violated this thing and that thing. And so I literally, for months, lived with the daily fear, like that at night they would come get me. There'd be a knock on the door and I would basically be taken away to prison, with no due process, no warning, that it would happen in front of my wife and son. They would handcuff me and put me into prison. And I was really scared that once I got into prison, I wouldn't get out, because if they could, concoct this case against me.
Then what else is possible?
And lock me up with no trial, which is what happened for 2 years and 2 months. I'm like, I think they're going to try to put me in a situation where, I'd be in harm's way, or they'd even kill me. Because, see, understand this. I had knowledge as a lawyer that a lot of bad stuff goes down in prison. I've been in 50 different prisons as a lawyer with clients. And people die in prison. I mean, Rikers Island over here in New York, there's probably 25, 30 people who get killed every year. And no one even gives a damn for the most part. So I was worried that it would be easy once I was in the prison setting for, if there was a plan, for it to happen. And so I was fighting like hell not to go into prison. I actually preferred being detained at home for a longer period of time to avoid getting into prison. So, part of the mental health challenge was the fear that on any moment, on any day, and this went on day after day for 2 years, they could just come get me, and disappear me basically. And I wouldn't even see my family again. So rational or not, and I don't think it was irrational for me to feel that way, that's how I felt. And it's not something I really wanted to share with my son, who, when this started, he was 13, he's now 16, or my wife, Laura, because, it was hard enough as it was for them to see me in this kind of thing, this situation with an ankle bracelet. And I didn't want to have the added burden of them to know my deepest, innermost traumatic feelings about worst case scenarios. So I kept it cool, or tried to. But it was hard, because I'd get phone calls in the middle of the night from the court officers. Are you home? I had an ankle bracelet with a battery. It would beep, and there'd be some recording coming on that woke us up 2 a.m, 4 a.m, with constant disruptions that I think are designed to psychologically destabilize you.
Definitely.
And not to mention it's physically exhausting because you can't get a good night's sleep. I don't think I had a good night's sleep for 3 years. Okay. And, I dealt with it by working. I worked my butt off, to fight for myself and for my clients in Ecuador, and just for awareness. And that was therapeutic for me, not to mention necessary to get me through it.
Did you talk to anyone?
I did. Yeah, I did. I mean, it wasn't so much a professional therapist that I would talk to, but I just had a lot of people, friends, and also lawyers, a couple of people I went to law school with who totally got it. And, there are so many things to talk about. There's the legal part of it, and then there's the personal part of it, and then there's the family part of it. And I always had people I could lean on. And I'm glad you said that, because I needed solidarity. I needed to build it, because that's what carried me through it. But I will say about my son, who basically lost the full use of his father. I mean, in a weird way, I was always home, so we hung out a lot. But in a bad way, we couldn't travel, we couldn't go to the park, we couldn't do the things that could go to games or shows or do the things that parents usually do with their kids. Everything
also
was
mentally,
everything
you're
was
probably
at home. Not to mention, and he'd bring a friend over. He didn't, it was embarrassing. His dad had an ankle bracelet, but my son never complained. He understood at some visceral level, what was going on. It's not to say it didn't hurt him. I know it did, but he never complained. He never said, "Dad, I wish we could do this." He never made me feel bad, and I just love him so much for the way he handled it. Also, my wife. By the way, my wife and I decided at the beginning, this is before they charged me with this criminal contempt, but like they were attacking me publicly and in the press and in other sort of civil court cases. And we made an agreement at the beginning that we were never going to let the trauma turn into a pathology. And that's an important distinction. We were experiencing trauma, but we had a kid to protect. And we didn't want our trauma to dominate our home life. We didn't become insular and we didn't become obsessed with it.
How did you deal though with like feeling like the whole world was conspiring? Or I can imagine that you felt like, you know, people are conspiring against you and they're almost gaslighting you. And do you start to believe like, oh yeah, maybe I did do that thing that they told me I did, or, you know, that they're charging me with? Yeah. Like, did you feel crazy at any point?
That's a great question. Yeah, I did. Because, see, it would have been a lot easier if I actually had done something wrong. Oh, I did something wrong. They're right. Okay, I'm just going to apologize and get through it. But when they're lying about you, it starts testing your ability to maintain your mental discipline and your psychological and emotional discipline.
And delusion.
You're like, well, maybe, did I do something wrong? And then you start going back and thinking about all the things you did. Mm-hmm. Wait, they said that. So wait a second, they did that too. And that was okay because Ecuador law allows, meetings with judges. That was like one of their big issues. And they tried to act like all these things I did that were appropriate, like when we were working down in Ecuador on the case, were somehow illegal. And they weren't illegal. Ecuador's courts allowed them and they were fine. They were, both sides were fighting it out, So it was a challenge to resist the mental beatdown, and it sort of made me realize how people do false confessions. Mm-hmm. Like you're under so much psychological pressure, like that you just, just to get the people off your back. And they try to convince you like to confess to crimes you didn't commit, But of course it never got to that point with me because I knew that's not what happened. Mm-hmm. But I the tension, the stress, the desire to escape what's happening to you through any means necessary, is very strong, very strong.
What do you hope for other people who are in a similar situation to you, or do you have any words of wisdom?
Well, I would just say that, say someone's arrested and the detectives or the cops try to pressure you, mm-hmm. Just understand that keep your mouth shut and don't say anything until you can get a lawyer, number one. And in these kinds of situations, you got to build solidarity. I mean, when you're an environmental justice advocate and the whole industry is trying to come down on you, you have to have a network of support and solidarity with groups. And I had this, mm-hmm. luckily, to allow you to maintain your sanity and your sense of equilibrium and your ability to keep fighting rationally. I mean, they have a lot of money and power, but we also have a lot of people, mm-hmm. numbers and people, and a lot of power through our solidarity. And we need to understand that we have a lot of power, we have a lot of leverage, we just have to know how to organize it so we can use it.
Definitely. I was even thinking when we were just talking about that, like maybe some of my young listeners and like on such a minute level, but like someone starting a rumor about you that is not true.
Right.
And like, how do you not, question your reality? Just a interesting psychological, what humans go through.
It is. And I think that, like, say someone's in high school and there's a rumor about them. I mean, I think the same principles apply. Mm-hmm. Like, talk to your trusted friends. Say, there's this rumor going around about me, like it's BS. And then, you can neutralize the rumor by telling people the truth and getting people to sort of, spread the proper version of reality.
Well, I also think false information just travels so quickly these days with social media. And I know before you came here, we were discussing a bit of like, I even saw that the Times, like they recently wrote something on you in the last year, but before that, they hadn't written anything on your case since 2013.
I know. It's amazing. I mean, the New York Times completely ignored the fact I was locked up. I mean, they just didn't report on it. They reported a short story the day I went to prison, oddly enough. But I'm sitting there in my home for 2 years and 2 months trying to get them to do a story, and they wouldn't. And it turns out that one of the key Chevron lawyers, the private Chevron lawyer attacking me, also works for the New York Times. And Chevron's a major advertiser. So, they'll tell you, oh, their editorial decisions are totally independent of their advertising. I mean, it's just not true. I think the New York Times could have done a heck of a lot better, but I will say there were a lot of independent media outlets that did report on me. Michael Moore, Ralph Nader, Katie Halper, Crystal Ball,
I saw a thing with you, Democracy Now!
Democracy Now!, The Intercept, The Nation, James North. I mean, I got a lot of attention from outlets that could actually have the ability to report in a balanced way about what was happening. I mean, the New York Times couldn't do that, nor could any of the other mainstream newspapers.
Because they have ties to Chevron.
It's certainly true in my opinion.
Well, also, didn't Judge Kaplan, wasn't he a tobacco lawyer or tobacco judge or something?
Big tobacco
defense lawyer. Yes.
Yeah, he represented the tobacco industry for years at the highest level.
What was it like, I guess, just being prosecuted by, like, the big man or, a big, scary company with endless money, like billions of dollars for endless litigation, and they're going against an individual, which is kind of what we touched on in the beginning. But, like, I can't imagine did you feel hopeless ever?
Well, I never felt hopeless because I knew I had me. And I knew the truth. And I knew what had really happened. I felt demoralized at times, like, how do I marshal the resources to get my narrative out there? And, the Wall Street Journal was editorializing against me, and my wife, was like, do you think you'll ever get your name back? And I said, I don't think I'm ever going to get my name back. I said, but what we can do is tell our truth and get my narrative out there. So there's at least two narratives. There's Chevron's paid narrative, and then there's my personal narrative, my truth, and let people decide who's right and who's wrong. Let them look at both. And I have been successful with that strategy. I mean, it's taken years to get back to the point where I could, compete with their narrative. But now I think we are dominating their narrative. I mean, if you just look at what they say, it just makes no sense. And it's contrary to the evidence. And they had to go to these lengths, that is, to manipulate the judicial system by locking me up at the behest of a Chevron lawyer in the name of the U.S. government. In a weird way, people look at that and they're like, that's crazy.
I mean, that's
they're like, that guy must be right if they're going to those lengths, because if they were right, they wouldn't have to do all that to get them locked up. And I will say a lot of lawyers from the right-wing parts, the pro-corporate parts of the legal profession, are very supportive of me. I have an appeal now before the U.S. Supreme Court because in our system of constitutional government in the United States, we have something called the separation of powers. Crime is prosecuted by the executive branch, not by judges. Judges preside over the cases, but they do not become prosecutors. And in my case, the judge, served as the grand jury. That is, he indicted me, charged me, and he was the judge in the case, and he was the de facto prosecutor because he appointed the prosecutor who wasn't a U.S. government official. So he was judge, jury, and prosecutor. One man was in my case, and it's just crazy.
So what's your hope for the case?
So my primary hope is that there's attention is refocused on the indigenous peoples in the Amazon, and they are able to collect the judgment, the money that Chevron owes them, so they can clean up all the poisoned lands that Chevron created down there in Ecuador, so lives can be saved. And they have lawyers who are working with them to hopefully do that by forcing Chevron to pay the judgment, by going after them in various countries where they have assets. And that's the number one hope. Secondly, I hope that I am able to get my life back fully. I mean, I have a lot of it back, but I need to be able to practice law and travel. They have my passport.
They have your passport too?
They took my passport and won't give it back as a coercive measure to try to get me to turn my computer over to Chevron.
Oh, they still want the computer. They're
Still
not
want
giving up on the computer.
It's not over. It's not over. So there's all sorts of legal battles, and I still live in a fair amount of peril, depending on what the court decides to do. But I'm going to hold my ground.
And so you just are waiting. It's in their hands.
I'm just waiting, and we'll see how it plays out. I mean, I think they're waiting too, to see how the Supreme Court, what they decide, if they decide to take it up or not. But ultimately, the battle to force Chevron to respect the law, abide by the law, as regards what they did in Ecuador is really important. And I think that's going to be playing out over the next several months and in the near term, 2-3 years.
Do you have hope, even after all of this time, that the Ecuadorian people might actually get this money?
Yes, definitely.
Okay.
Definitely. I mean, Chevron tries to convince through, what I've been through, convince the world that somehow it's over, they won. I mean, let me be clear. The people of Ecuador won the case. We won the case. Yeah. They lost. The case has been affirmed on appeal by 6 appellate courts, 28 appellate judges. They still refuse to pay.
And they just took their assets out of there,
They took their assets out of Ecuador, and they just run around the world daring the indigenous people to chase them. I mean, it's outrageous. Yeah. It's an outrageous, disrespect for people.
Well,
and disrespect for the law, but it's how they roll. It's how the fossil fuel industry rolls, and it's connected to our planet and the climate crisis.
I know. Well, you're very motivated by climate, and so what brought you to that?
Well,
why is that specific issue?
Yeah. Well, first of all, if we don't adequately address the climate crisis, not much else is really going to matter, and we have to do it for obvious reasons, because it's like all of life on this planet is under threat right now. And the Ukraine war, by the way, has made it worse, because oil companies are now making more money than they ever have before. Their stock prices are high, and they're locking in deals to continue drilling for the next 20, 30 years, which will destroy the planet. So we're in a critical moment now. But also I realize that all my work trying to hold Chevron accountable for its massive pollution in Ecuador's Amazon is connected to that issue.
Totally.
Because if you can't stop the polluters from, wreaking havoc and really wrecking delicate ecosystems, it's going to be very hard to address the climate crisis. And this is where our legal system needs to really step up and stop being so pro-corporate.
What are your thoughts on the individual versus corporations in terms of climate change? Like someone not having their AC running or using paper straws versus corporations.
Well, I believe everyone has a role to play, but it's tricky. And this is sort of, I would warn people. First of all, do whatever you can. Paper straws are cool.
Or not eat meat.
Sell your car, don't eat meat, travel less on airplanes. That all matters. But it pales in comparison to the harm caused by the industry. So I would say do what you can, but the industry is constantly trying to convince us that
it's up to the individual.
Up to the individual. It's a question of individual responsibility as a way to distract
100%.
Attention for their own massive role in creating this crisis. So while people, I think, should do those things, people need to distinguish between what they can do personally and where the real bulk of the problem lies right now, which is with industry. So do those things, but be careful. It's not all up to you.
And continually educate yourself. And like we even mentioned, how skewed and biased a lot of these news sources are, especially for my young listeners, to, get the full story as much as you can in journalism and kind of look at these other outlets.
That's very true. And I think, getting back to the New York Times, they wouldn't write about my detention. And think about what that means. I mean, it's that doesn't matter, to this big mainstream news outlet that has so much influence still in our society. But it does matter, so we need to continually build up independent media outlets. They might be smaller, social media. There's ways to get information out there now that we didn't have when I was growing up, in this country prior to the internet. So, we need to keep pushing, use every platform we can to expose the truth and to, try to get good, accurate information out there.
Among my friends in New York, I notice a lot of political apathy. I think especially during like the last election or last two elections, people had a lot of hope and they came out for a lot of different issues, whether it was like environment or many different things, and like Bernie running. And then I feel like people have kind of retreated and they don't feel as hopeful anymore. I've just noticed that with my friends and at dinner parties, and we'll talk about this, like people who are really motivated for change kind of felt like the door got slammed in their face. And so for those people, I guess like a word of advice, if you've been through the ringer and you still stay motivated.
Let me say this to all young people, in particular, don't give up. Don't descend into cynicism. We have a lot of problems in this world and in this country. I'm not a big fan, for example, of the two-party system because there's no real Labor Party in the United States. And the Democratic Party is heavily under the influence of the fossil fuel industry. Not as bad as the Republicans, who are essentially bought out by the fossil fuel industry. But like Chuck Schumer, for example, a senator in New York, he's the third largest recipient of fossil fuel money of anyone in the U.S. Senate, Republican or Democrat. So our problems run really deep, and our political system is failing. So people need to engage.
I know, because I'm like, wait, what you just said does not make me feel hopeful.
No, but I'm saying engage. Step one to me is decolonize your brain. Okay, there's so much bad information out there.
I know. Can you name a couple of places where we can find good
for example,
information?
On the climate issue, Inside Climate News is a great website. On general corruption, there's a website, a news outlet called ProPublica, where they do great investigative work. David Sirota has a news outlet called Lever News, Lever. It does great work. You can find him on Twitter. And then on Substack, there's a lot of great journalists writing, like Chris Hedges and others. But these are giants of the journalistic field who cannot find a place in the networks or in the main newspapers because they won't actually cover these things and tell the truth. So, I would urge people to look at some of these sites, like subscribe. It's not expensive and often it's free. And just keep in touch with sources of information that can really inform you. Listen, what's very clear is the powers that be are not going to do it without pressure from citizens. And we have the numbers. We have to stay engaged. We have to stay organized.
It just seems like they just try to sweep everything under the rug. I mean, I was just even talking different issue, but like Jeffrey Epstein, for example. I haven't seen that really in the news in a long time.
Yeah.
And another thing that I'm like, okay, where is this list of powerful people? And why isn't it being released to the public so that the public can put pressure on it? But again, it's something that's swept under the rug, and it feels like it will slowly go away.
I think that's a great example of exactly what you're talking about. I mean, there is a book with all sorts of people's names in that book who were dealing with Jeffrey Epstein. Why hasn't that not been released?
I know, and there's some.
And ironically, the judge who refused to release it is the same judge who sentenced me to prison, by the way.
Really?
Yeah, and she has a history, Judge Loretta Preska, of protecting powerful interests, corporate interests, or powerful individuals. So, the whole Jeffrey Epstein saga, as with many things, the people who engage in some of these nefarious practices prefer to operate in the dark. And by the way, the reason I'm here today and I keep talking about what happened to me is because the more it gets out there, the harder it is for Chevron and Judge Kaplan to keep attacking me. I mean, in a weird way, I'm enjoying this conversation. But
I'm like, you don't like talking to me? You didn't like making a TikTok with me?
I could be watching a World Cup game today, but hey, and I'm happy to be here, but I have to get out and talk.
Totally.
Because otherwise they get away with it.
Yeah.
I mean, they still might get away with it.
No, but I also think
are less.
It sheds light not only on this specific issue, but then it's like, okay, what other things are being covered up and are in the interest of greater corporations and these $1 trillion industries
that don't have
the general public's best
look
interest.
at the issue of deception on the climate, the global warming issue, and there's lawsuits now that are discovering that throughout the 70s, 80s, 90s, up to today, Exxon, Chevron, all the big oil companies conspired to dupe the public about the negative impact of the
climate
fossil
change,
fuel
and then
industry.
it's not real these days.
Yeah.
It just seems more polarized than ever, and not having these more honest, unbiased conversations. No one even debates things anymore.
That's why, again, when I said people need to decolonize their heads, look for sources of information
that are coming directly from,
that will be more real, more truthful, and really train yourself to think for yourself.
Do you have a lot of personal distrust with the media now?
Well, I distinguish between the mainstream big media outlets that are funded by corporate advertising and then the independent ones. The big ones, distrust. I know what they are, and so I watch them with a bit of a grain of salt.
And did you always feel like you knew what they were, even when you worked in journalism back
No.
in the day, or it was really through this experience?
I think when I was younger, I didn't really fully understand that. Over time, little by little, when you sort of work on progressive causes or lawsuits, and you sort of see how you're treated, you sort of, gain a greater degree of awareness. But it really kicked in over the last 5 years when I saw how they dealt with my situation.
Yeah.
Where they couldn't cover it. Because even MSNBC, which is the liberal cable network, gets massive advertising from Chevron, Harper's Magazine, Thinking Woman's Magazine, advertising from Chevron, The Atlantic, advertising from Chevron. Chevron strategically buys off
everyone,
some of the more liberal publications, so they don't cover these hard issues.
And so, what about presidential candidates too, or just politicians as well?
I think there's the establishment and the non-establishment, and I think,
getting paid off though by...
I think that it's, I don't think we have a true independent, viable candidate in this country to run for president, although I wish we did.
Okay, in certain ways, I kind of feel like you are one of the figureheads of climate change. And does that weigh on you at all?
No. First of all, I believe I have a responsibility, given the platform that's been built because of my experience, to speak out and to use it and to help other people too. So I use my platform to help people fighting these causes all over the world. People in Serbia, Hawaii, North Carolina, and I just try to promote, amplify what people are doing. I'm hardly, the world's leading expert, but I do have a perspective on it given my bizarre experience, going toe-to-toe with an oil company now for 13 years. I know how they think. I know how they operate. I know their tricks. I know their dirty tricks. I know their legal sabotage efforts. I know how they try to use the law to intimidate people. And I am really good at calling them out and connecting the dots.
Do you believe that everything happens for a reason?
I haven't really thought about that.
Existential question.
But I think that it's important to be alert to opportunity. My mom always told me, my mom who took me to protests when I was a little kid, she always said, God never closes one door without opening another. You just have to know where to look. Mm. And it is true. If you get hit hard by something, or something goes amiss, or some dream gets squelched, it ain't over. Yeah. Just move a little bit of a distance away and start over on something else, or do the same thing from a different angle. Mm-hmm. So it's very important that people, if to the extent they can, maintain positive, optimistic attitudes, even if things don't look great. We have a duty to the future. We are all the ancestors of people to come. Think about that. How do you want to be seen? How do you want them to see their ancestors, meaning us? What are we doing? And so we can never give up. We always have to keep fighting, never descend into cynicism. And we just have to keep pushing and understand we're all the people doing this work are in solidarity with each other. By the way, they want to keep us apart. They didn't want you and I to meet. We met through some chance meeting, and now here I am on your couch, okay? I mean, they don't want us to know each other. They don't want your audience to know me.
I know they don't want all my young, pretty big audience of young people to know about this case.
True. It's true. So we need to connect. We need to keep connecting with each other, young, old. By the way, I get invited regularly to speak to universities and law schools.
Do you do that?
I do it I had a policy, by the way, when I got locked up. I'm like, I will talk to anybody. I'll talk to a kindergarten class, okay, about my situation. And I never turned down one invitation.
How did you even get to Ecuador? Or how
because I in law school, I met someone from Ecuador who told me about this.
Oh,
and
really? And then
an investigation trip.
Okay,
that's how the whole case started.
So it was kind of by chance.
Totally by chance. That's another advice I'd give people. Like, be flexible, be open. Like, if you don't know exactly what you really want to do when you grow up yet, even if you're in your late 20s or whatever, it's okay. Like, I'm 61. In many respects, I don't know what I'm going to do when I grow up. I mean, like, I love life, and you always got to be alert to opportunity. And when you start down a path, you never know if it's going to, like, evolve into a journey. Mm-hmm. And once it's a journey, you never know how long it's going to last. In my case, of course, I never could have anticipated that this is how my life would unfold. But now that it has unfolded in this way, I feel fortunate and honored and enriched. And even though they basically took all my money, which is a whole other aspect of this, I have a defense fund and we're able to live. My wife works and I have no bank account, but I feel really rich, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, why no bank account?
Because Judge Kaplan, as part of their effort to destroy me, ordered me to pay millions of dollars to Chevron for their legal fees. So the money I had, they, without telling me, went into all my law firm account and personal bank accounts and wiped it out.
They can do that?
No, but they did, and they got away with it. I mean, I guess yes is the answer.
Okay, so it's...
So they took all my money, and I don't have any money left, and I don't want any money. Now, I need resources to live. But I basically accepted the fact that for the rest of my life, I'm not going to have money. Now think about that for a second. I want your listeners to understand this point. When I first went to the Amazon in the 1990s, the entire ethos of the indigenous peoples was they could live rich and they had no money. So imagine a life with no money. I ask this, by the way, to students a lot when I speak. Can you imagine not having money but still being rich?
Not in New York City.
Well, no. Well, but that's not the point.
Like in the Amazon where I'm living off the resources, possibly if I'm surrounded by a community that has, generations of how I use that palm or,
No, of course. But my point is New York City is an anomaly. Like, this is a bizarre, this is a bizarre place. Yeah, you need money here, for sure. But it is historically, these groups that I help in Ecuador lived with no money, and they were fine.
Totally.
And the ultimate irony is I always had money. And now I'm like them. I mean, I'm working on this for 28 years, and I have no money, but I feel really rich.
You feel like you're purposeful.
You're purposeful. No, I still would like to have money.
Don't
misunderstand me. I'd feel better with some financial security.
So is the goal then?
But I'm trusting the gods because I think it's all going to work out, and it has. Basically, it's basically two main things. I want to travel and I want to work.
Okay.
And the travel, I need a passport.
Yeah.
And the work, I need a law license. Now I can still do work without a law license. I just can't, practice law. I can't go into court, but I can still use my advocacy skills to help people, which I do. And I also have a lot of legal skills and legal knowledge, and that comes in handy with the advocacy. Mm-hmm. With the passport issue and the travel, I mean, I'm a big traveler. Like I working on this case, I'm an international human rights lawyer. I mean, I need to get to Ecuador. I need to get to Europe, to deal with our contacts there. I need to get to Canada, and they won't let me out of the country. So that's a huge, huge blow to my ability to be a full human rights lawyer, and that needs to change.
Mm-hmm. And also just to live your life and, again, have your sanity, if that's something that's important to you.
Yes.
As a person.
And it is. Let me say this, and this is the way of unsolicited career advice for your listeners. When you start on a journey in your career, like, you don't know where it's going to go. I mean, you can always get off of it and start something else if it's not working out. I think the most important thing is to let life unfold. There's a beauty to life, a creativity, a improvisational quality. And I think too often young people are like, I got to pay off my student debts, and I just want to make this much money by this age, and then I want this by this age. And, if that's how you want to look at it, cool. But there's another way to look at it, which is just let it roll, and take advantage of the opportunities and figure out how you can make it work for you. Because the most important thing to me is that you enjoy what you do and that you're passionate about it. And I find that even if you make less money at the beginning, if it really is something you like doing, over time, it's going to even out. You're going to end up making more money because you're going to be really good at what you do because you like it and you care about it. So...
I mean, it's the famous quote. It's find what you love and you won't work a day in your life.
Yeah, that is it, and I think, you have been through your journey and you started a successful podcast, there's ways to make it work, ways to make it happen. And, everybody faces this. Yeah. And, just be cool and understand that your journey will take you places you never anticipated. I've been in prison for 45 days. And of course, I always had been in prison as a lawyer, but I've never been in prison as an inmate. And that just completely opened my eyes.
What was that shift like to be on the other side of it?
It was insane, intense. But there's a lot of humanity in prison.
Are there a lot of dehumanizing elements, though?
Oh, my God, yes.
Just maybe even from the system.
Yeah, that's a great question. Let me just say this. The fundamental contest in prison is between the dehumanization necessity of the administration of prisons and the innate humanity of every inmate. And it's a constant battle. And it takes place in a lot of interesting ways, constantly, 24/7. And what I noticed is there's a tremendous solidarity among prisoners for each other, for the most part. There's fights and stuff. But generally, it's like, we have to survive this. And I understood a lot more about the human condition having been to prison, because there were so many dehumanizing aspects, starting from the fact that when you walk in there, they strip you down, take your clothes, crunch them up, put them in a box. Then you have to sign something. They're going to send them home. And then they give you their outfit, which is sameness. Everybody has the same outfit. So you lose your identity. You're given a number, a Bureau of Prisons number, where you're usually referred to by your number, not by your name, and by the staff. And everything becomes completely restricted, including the fact I lived in a cell built for one. There were 2 people in the cell. And I was the only person in the entire prison who hadn't been convicted of a felony offense. I was convicted of a misdemeanor. And no one understood why I was there. But I was able to connect with lots of people in very difficult circumstances. And it was inspiring. I really met a lot of interesting people in prison who, even many obviously had made mistakes. That's why they were there. But many shouldn't have been there. Or they were there for far too long, given what they did. The sentences in prison are crazy.
But also just like life circumstances that lead someone to prison a lot of the time is because you don't have a safety net, and the education system failed you, or I've had several people on this podcast who have been in prison, and then I've had people who work in prisons.
I found there's not a huge gap between people in prison and like correctional officers who work there. A lot of these people know each other. They come from the same backgrounds.
Literally come from the same communities. Yeah. It's
a fine line. And also correctional officers are really exploited. They're abused. They get paid very little. Their jobs are very tough, and they're very stressful. So I didn't look at prison guards as like the enemy. I felt like they were human beings too, and it was just bizarre to be in there. I couldn't get fresh vegetables. I don't know about you, but I like my salads and my fresh vegetables. I also eat French fries. I'm not like a food fanatic about health, but I need vegetables. And I got there and I noticed there were no vegetables, at the meals. Why are there no vegetables? I asked the guys, and they're like, well, because it's the end of the year and there's so much food pilfered out of the kitchen by the staff. This is what they told me, by the guards and by inmates who work there, and they take food and sell it back in the dorms, that at the end of the year, the budget's really low. There's not enough money to buy vegetables. So they serve things like grits in place of a vegetable. And so that's pretty interesting. And
that would make me
so I
crazy.
spread the word in my dorm that I wanted just a carrot or a piece of celery. And this is a crazy story, but one time this inmate who had a lot of status came back. He called me. He nicknamed me Counselor because I'm like a lawyer. He goes, Counselor, I got something for you. And like he pulled this enormous carrot out of like his satchel, and it had dirt on it. It looked like it had just been grown like in prison ground. I don't know where he got it. And he made me pay him for the carrot. So I took possession of the carrot, washed it, and I stuck it in my room, and I literally nibbled on it for 10 days so it would last.
Like a rabbit.
And that was the only fresh vegetable I had for the most part. But this is crazy. After I finished the carrot, like every night at 9 o'clock, they'd have something called count, where you'd have to get in front of your cell, and the guards would come through and count you one by one. And you'd stand there. I noticed at the end of the hall, there was a guard, and it looked, I wasn't 100% sure, but it looked like he was carrying a carrot in his hand. I'm like, wow, a carrot. And like the oddest thing is I saw him toss it into this trash can, like at the end of the hall. So I made a mental note. I said, after count, I'm going to go down and dig that carrot out of that trash can. Okay, because I want that carrot, if it indeed is a carrot. So when the count ended, I walked down to the garbage can. There's a lot of inmates milling around. By the way, the inmates, contrary to maybe what most people believe, are really clean. Like they keep the dorm super clean. It's like the idea of going into a trash can and pulling something out is not something you want to be seen doing in prison. So I went and I saw the trash can. There was like, I saw the carrot. It was a carrot. And I'm like, wow. And I looked around. I'm like, should you take it out? Like, you know? And like people were looking, and I decided not to. I said, I'll come back in like 5 or 10 minutes when like there's fewer people around. And when I came back, someone had emptied the garbage and the carrot was gone. And like, but what's the point? The point is, I mean, okay, one point is there's no real good food in prison. But the second point is like, I found myself being driven to do like desperate things, like literally digging into a trash bin to try to get a fresh vegetable. I mean, here I am. I went to Harvard Law School with Barack Obama. Okay. And I'm like, I'm about to go dumpster diving because I'm an inmate in a prison and I can't get a fresh vegetable. And like, and you know, part of the mental health challenge, by the way, of prison, I found was to guard against these tendencies that prison brings out in you to become a worse person. Mm-hmm. You know, it's so desperate in there. And when the sentences are long, people often lose hope and they feel like they have nothing to live for. And, you know, if you're there long enough, your loved ones stop writing you and stop calling, and you become very isolated. And I noticed this, and I'm like, I don't know how long I'm going to be here. And of course, I knew I was not going to be there a day longer than 6 months, I hoped, you know, because my sentence was 6 months. So I had a really short sentence compared to most people. But I said, do not get comfortable here. Do not make this your normal. Do not like enjoy this. I mean, obviously I wasn't going to enjoy it, but like you can get into a routine in prison where it's your life. I mean, you live there for years. And some of these inmates, I mean, I'm talking about decades people are living in prison.
And it's the largest psychiatric.
Yeah, it's a mental health hospital.
Yeah, it's the largest mental health hospital. How our country and government deals with mentally unwell people as they send them to prison. And they're literally forgotten. Like nobody thinks about them. Nobody talks about them. No one even cares, because I feel like when you go to prison, you get the sticker of, oh, well, they must have done something bad to get there, so they don't deserve my empathy and they're no longer human.
Well, I will say that's exactly what Chevron's intention was with me, right? Mm-hmm. People are like, oh, if Stephen Donziger was in prison, he must have done something wrong. Otherwise, he wouldn't be in prison. Mm-hmm. You know, and it's just, that's a tautological thing. And it's just, in my case, it wasn't true. And in the case of many others, it's not true in terms of concluding they're bad people. But it's like, you know, that carrot became a real symbol for me, you know, because it's an environment where there's tremendous deprivation on every level. And if you can't count on your inner resources, your soul, your strength, and your family and others to somehow get through that experience with your humanity intact, it's going to end. I mean, there were people in prison who essentially lived, I mean, you couldn't get a carrot, but you could get a lot of psychotropic drugs to keep you sedated. I mean, that was another thing I saw a lot in prison. The pharmacy was giving out a lot of drugs to take the edge off people. And, you know, there's hardly any counselors, almost no educational opportunity. Like
Really?
you couldn't get a degree in prison. You know, you had to actually get it offline. I mean, how crazy is this? They wouldn't give us access to the internet. I mean, there's all sorts of free education going on from the best universities in the world on the internet. And because they wouldn't give inmates access to the internet, they couldn't get an education. And that would have cost the prison system nothing. You know, so the system is designed to, I think, set people up for failure.
100%.
And I just refuse to succumb to it. I mean, I was like, you're not succumbing to this. You know, and I spent a lot of time talking to people. I kept a journal. I have a journal that maybe someday will be a book.
It doesn't rehabilitate you, jail, at all. It sets you up to like ruin your life.
I would argue it's designed to make sure you come back. I mean, it's a business. You know, the recidivism rate in America is, I don't know, 60, 70%.
And a lot of them are privately owned or funded.
And they're for profit. As a matter of fact, when I got home, remember I got out after 45 days, and I served the last, you know, that was a month and a half, so I served the last 4.5 months at home, in my home with an ankle bracelet. There was a private company called the Geo Group that was being paid by us, by taxpayers, to monitor me and about 1 million other people who were home, serving home incarceration. And, you know, they would call me multiple times a day and harass me. They had a call center. You know, I had to go give urine tests at this halfway house every once in a while. There was a whole cottage industry built up around surveillance and monitoring people. I mean, people were making money off of it. You know, so they see these incarceration plays as profit opportunities. I mean, we're going to keep pushing, and we're going to keep building. And ultimately, we not only want to hold Chevron fully accountable and make sure they pay the people they poisoned down in Ecuador, we want to make sure that we create a society where no lawyer or climate activist or any advocate for that matter gets attacked and jailed for exercising the First Amendment right to hold corporations accountable. That can't happen again. Understand it involves everyone in our society who cares about democracy, free speech, and climate justice, because we cannot let corporations do this to anyone else.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. And thank you for coming down here today.
Thank you for having me.
To meet me.